Go and okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi Stephen. Good morning, everybody. I'm speaking today about John Monash, born in 1865 in Melbourne. His parents came over from Crottagin 2 years before to Australia. The Monash family were in fact famed for the fact that in the early 19th century, they printed the Crottagin edition of the Talmud, and it was only superseded later in the century when the Rom family, they printed the Vilna edition, which is still used today. Young John had his bar mitzvah at the East Melbourne congregation, the St Kilda congregation, in 1878. In 1891, he married Annie Morris, and they had one daughter, Bertha, and she passed away in 1979. He took a degree at the University of Melbourne. He had a Master of Engineering in 1893, and he took a law degree 2 years later. He was a civil engineer by profession, constructing bridges and railways using improvised concrete, which was something novel in those days. But already when he was 19, he came into the militia, and he graduated from being a lieutenant on the eve of the First World War. He was a colonel, and he was in command of the 4th Infantry. And then when the war was declared in August 1914, they were sent to Gallipoli, and he was the commander of this brigade. And if you know about Gallipoli in 1915, April, you'll know that it was almost impossible to defeat the Turks. They wanted to keep the Dardanelles Straits open for Allied shipping, but the Turks were firing down from the top of the cliffs, and it was impregnable, and it was very, very difficult. The troops that were being sent there were being decimated, but because of his engineering skills and because of his organizational skills, he was able to keep his losses down to a minimum. And by the time they left the Gallipoli at the end of the year, thank God, compared with others in the different regiments, his number of fatalities was kept down to a minimum. From there, they went to the Western Front. He'd been a colonel when the war began, but he became a brigadier general when they were in the Dardanelles. And now, in early 1916, he was on the Western Front, where they would be for the next 2.5 years. And he became a major general. What's important to point out is that when he became a colonel and then he became a major general on the Western Front, there was opposition to him because he was, number one, Jewish, number two, he was of German ancestry. And so he managed to overcome the opposition on both times. When he came to the Western Front in 1916, there was the disastrous Battle of Passchendaele, where there were so many losses on the first day. I think it was over 60,000 who perished on the first day. It was one of the most disastrous battles of the First World War. And there he was with his troops. And they fought right through different battles between 1916 and 1918. In 1918, he was then commander of what they called the Australian Corps. And he had under his command 200,000 men. There were generals under him as well, but he was the leading general. And they fought, as I say, different battles between 1916 and 1918. And he was the one Jewish general at the time. In August of 1918, King George V, came over to the Western Front, and he gave Monash a signal honor. He knighted him on the Western Front battlefield. And this showed what not only the king thought of him, but what people in general, in fact, his troops were so loyal to him that they almost worshipped him, because he was one of the few generals of the time who actually looked after his troops properly. And I just mentioned that, that Field Marshal Montgomery, who was a colonel at the time of the First World War, he actually said about Monash that he, in his estimation, was the finest general in the Western Front. And when David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of Britain between 1960 and 1922, wrote up his memoirs, he said, these are his words, "I've been told by men whose judgment I value that there was one soldier who had all the qualifications for the position, but I did not know anything about it at the time." What was the position he had in mind? It was that of Commander-in-Chief of all the Allied forces. And why was he not told about it? Because Monash had ascended through the militia, which was part-time, not through the military, which was full-time. So they had a prejudice against him, and they didn't tell the Prime Minister that he would be the actual person who could be, if the war had gone on longer, Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces. What happened after the war? He was in London. He was in charge of repatriation and demobilization of the Australian, New Zealand forces. And incidentally, can I mention that when they left Gallipoli, the 25th of April, every year since then, was kept as Anzac, Australian, New Zealand Memorial Day. Just as we keep Armistice Day on the 11th of November, they keep the 25th of April as their special Anzac Day. After demobilization happened, in 1919, he led his forces back to Australia to a rapturous and roarous welcome. 2 years later, in 1921, he became the first Australian Doctor of Engineering. He went back to his firm because that was his profession in engineering. 2 years later, 1923, he became Vice Chancellor of Melbourne University. 4 years later, 1927, he became President of the Zionist Federation of Australia and New Zealand. And in his own lifetime, he was the greatest Australian. 4 years later, at the age of 66, he had a heart attack and tragically he passed away. And to his funeral, 300,000 citizens of Australia came to attend his funeral. And the Levaya was conducted by the young Rabbi Israel Brody, who was then the rabbi of the East Melbourne congregation. After he passed away, a university was named after him. Monash University is named after him. A statue was put up in his memory, and scholarships were also awarded in his memory. And to this day, even though it's almost over 90 years since he passed away, he's regarded to this day as one of the greatest Australians. And so I just wanted to bring this to your attention because he's not been forgotten, but in this part of the world, we don't tend to think of him in the same way as they do down below. And so I just wanted to mention General Sir John Monash, who was a great Jew and a great Australian.
Very much. Mr. General Monash? Yeah, never. It's in his statue. Yeah.
And it was in Melbourne.
In Melbourne?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
On the horseback, yeah. It's interesting that Rabbi Brody was there in Australia.
Well, rabbis originated.
Yes. A lot of them went out after the war as well. Yeah. Well,
Great, thank you very much. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. As usual, you give us an insight into some historical figures which we don't normally learn about, and that was very, very interesting as usual. Thank you so much. I will turn off the I'll turn off the Zoom now for those on Zoom. We'll see you all next week. Have a good week.